everyone, thank you for joining us for a video discussion. So Judy and I today are going to talk about measuring. So measuring your body, understanding measurements that reflect your metabolic health and so forth. So Judy, so known as the food coach, and my name is Louise and I'm one of the doctors at Viv. So at Viv, we're really keen on supporting midlife women to be their healthiest versions of themselves, which does not mean their skinniest version or obsessed about their weight. And so I want to be careful when we talk about measuring ourselves and measuring our bodies, that we appreciate that what we're really focusing on here is how our body measurement relates to our health and specifically our metabolic health. So when we talk about biometrics, we're talking about ways to measure the body. And often we will be familiar with such words as BMI and so forth, but what these, a lot of these measurements we're familiar with, what they're used for is understanding the health of populations or study groups. So for example, the BMI cuts off 25 to 30, that's called overweight, for example. And then the researchers and the health economists look at all the diseases in that group as opposed to that in that group. So they're looking for trends and things that influence public health policy, spending of money, and so forth. So we're going to be looking at how those numbers and other numbers apply to you as an individual, which is quite different to applying them to a population. So when we're talking about metabolic health, Judy, how can we measure our body to get ideas about how we're going?
Well, I think the simplest and easiest way to do that is to get your weight, to start with your weight, and then look at your hip to waist ratio and your height to weight ratio. You're just looking at yourself. It's you that you need to be concerned with. So get a simple tape measure and wrap it around the narrowest part of your waist and the widest part of your hips. Now then you can use a calculator to divide your hips number by the waist, and that will give you a ratio that will tell you whether you're in a healthy range or a less healthy range, a higher risk range. The height to waist ratio is very useful also, because people who are tall may have a wider waist. If their waist is over 80 centimeters, there may be on population health studies that would be considered to be a slightly higher risk. But if you're a tall person, your waist is likely to be a little bit bigger in proportion to the whole frame. So 3 simple numbers: height you'll know, weight you can find out, and your waist and your hips ratio would be the simplest way to go.
Okay, so
at home.
How do I measure waist circumference?
Okay, so the narrowest. Oh, you've got a tape measure. Well, shall we demonstrate?
And I wore my skinny dress, so I could demonstrate. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's have a look.
Yeah.
Lovely dress, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's quite clear to see, Louise, where your waist is. So just the narrowest part, wrap it around. We're looking at centimeters. Being in Australia, you can do inches as well. And what is that, Louise?
It's about 84.
What's the measurement you've got?
About 84.
84. Yeah. So you are a great example of why these measurements are a rough guide, because I know you. You're tall. Less than 80 is considered to be healthy, and 80 to 88 is considered to be an increased rate. I know you're not you haven't got an increased rate, but what's interesting there, if you take that number, write it down, put a date to it, and do it in another month, and do it another month, if that's trending up, then that is a sign to do something about it. If it stays the same, you're healthy.
Okay. What happens if my shape, if I'm not narrow in here? So some women are broader here. I hear that like there's this little, somewhere halfway between your rib and your hip is roughly where your belly button is. So if women are not narrow there, do they measure at their belly button?
Yes, just take it across. I'm quite column shaped, so it goes across. It will go around my belly button. That's a great point.
Yeah. Okay. And so why do we care? Why do we care about so the hip? So the waist measurements 80 to 88 and above 88, and I would have to say that also is for European people. So people of Asian and Indian subcontinent, Middle East or ethnicity, their healthy weight waist measurement is lower, and their healthy BMI is also lower because they get diabetes and conditions like that at a lower percentage of body fat. So it's important to know that even your ethnicity makes a difference with that. So we've got your waist circumference 80 to 88, your waist to hip ratio, which should be what? What should that be?
Well, if your waist to hip ratio is 0.8 or below, that is considered to be healthy. Now, what this is doing is showing us where your weight or your fat is accumulating. So when fat is accumulating around the middle of the body, that is a sign that it is no longer subcutaneous fat that grows all around the body. It's fat known as visceral fat that's accumulated in and under the rib cavity. So that's the fat that we need to be concerned with when it comes to metabolic health. We don't really care what it looks like. It doesn't really matter if you're pinching a bit of fat under your arms. What does matter is to make sure the fat's not accumulating around your liver, your pancreas, and the other organs of your body.
Yeah, that's in that healthy inflammatory distribution that's associated with a lot of disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, etc. Okay. So when we're talking about body composition, we're interested in visceral abdominal or adipose tissue or abdominal fat. How can we measure, apart from our waist circumference, are there other ways we can measure that?
Well, the gold standard measurement, which I highly encourage people to do, is to go and get a DEXA bone density or a DEXA body composition scan, which also does bone density as well, which is a great thing to do at this stage of life. Anyway, the bone density. But the DEXA bone density scan will work out what your muscular weight is, your bone weight, and where your fat is accumulating, and will give it to you in a full percentage. So it really is the absolute star measurement that you can get.
Yeah. Okay. And how does someone get that?
Well, you could get one through the doctor. Go to the doctor and ask if you could be sent to one of these companies, PRP Imaging, some of these other companies, and get a bone density plus body composition. Or there are some private companies that do it as well. This is a chargeable thing, but I think it's worth doing, particularly if you do maybe one every couple of years. It's a great way to track how you're going with your body composition.
Yeah. And so you get your bone density, which is obviously really important, and you have to ask for your body composition because they won't do it standard. And DEXA is a low X-ray test. So there is a little bit of radiation, but really very little. So I think that's and it costs about $180 to $200 to get that test. And as for most people, there's no Medicare rebate. But so that tells us.
Sorry, no, I was going to say too, the great thing about doing the DEXA bone density scan, it also gives you your weight and muscle. So if you're training, you might get heavier, or you might become a little bit heavier as the year goes on. But if that weight is in muscle, that's a really good thing. Fat weighs less than muscle. Building up with muscle strength is fantastic from metabolic health. So I think encouraging people to get a body composition is a great thing to do.
Great way to measure yourself and your metrics. Just coming back to, we were talking a little bit earlier about the BMI and how it's a really rough measure but from a population point of view, if we just took, thousands of people with a higher BMI will have higher rates of chronic disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, heart disease, and people with a lower BMI will have lower rates of those disease. But for any individual, you can certainly have absolutely perfect metabolic health at a high BMI and terrible metabolic health at a low BMI. So it's not helpful necessarily to understand where your metabolic health is. And certainly the Australian rugby team would all be, obese in their BMI because they're full of muscle. So it's clearly no good for them. So we can also, so we're looking at body distribution of particularly where our body stores fat, which is a reflection of our metabolic health and the way we deal with our energy. We can also do some blood tests looking at metabolic health. So we can measure blood glucose and insulin, and a thing called HbA1c, which is glycosylated hemoglobin, which gives us an idea of how high our blood sugar levels have been over the last 3 months, which is a really cool test. And these all have normal values that we can monitor ourselves against. We can also check our triglycerides, which start to rise if insulin resistance is starting to happen for us, and also our blood lipids, which are another indicator of cardiometabolic health. So, from terms of the blood tests, we've got blood lipids, so the total cholesterol particles and the nature of whether they're high density or non-high density lipoprotein particles. We've got our blood sugar level, our baseline insulin, our HbA1c, and our triglycerides. We can also get some idea about inflammatory markers. So a thing called C-reactive protein can give us an idea of overall inflammation, but it's only subtly elevated, whereas in conditions that like infection, it's really elevated. So we can add our blood tests, which it's great to do them on an annual basis, to our measurements to see how we're going. The blood tests also help us interpret what the measurements mean. So if our waist measurement is a little elevated, but all our blood levels are normal, we're not too worried about it. But if our waist measurement is higher and our blood levels are not normal, we're wanting to get the waist measurement down. So for any individual, it's what does it mean? What do the measurements mean? And then we can also do some functional tests. So we can do a challenge test to your body to see how it responds to sugar, and that's called a glucose tolerance test, where you have a baseline blood test, you're given a really sticky, revolting, sugary drink, and your insulin and blood sugar is monitored over the next 2 hours to see how your body deals with it, how quickly it can pull the glucose out of the bloodstream and pull it back into the muscle and the liver. And it's a reflection of insulin sensitivity. So it's a good measure of metabolic health. So we've got layers of information that when we put them together, we can understand where we are in terms of our metabolic health and what are the things that we need to follow over time. So Jude, what are a simple way to measure ourselves over time? We've got annual blood tests, but apart from that.
Well, I think the simplest way is just get yourself a little spreadsheet, pop yourself on the scales, take the measurement, write it down, write the date, and then do that on a regular basis. You could, plot it, do a graph, just see how you're trending on that. I don't think it needs to be overly complicated, to be honest. I think getting the blood tests at the beginning is a great thing. Do the annually, do a body composition. You might not even need to do a body composition on an annual basis if you do those measurements month to month. I think that would be perfectly fine. What do you think?
I think it depends on how metabolically healthy you are. If you're really trying to change these things, we would measure more often. If you're really trying to change your health, we would measure more often, and we might be a bit more specific. But I think maybe the waist circumference and the way your clothes fit, noticing that, as well as the weight, is the simplest thing to do. But some people shouldn't be measuring themselves regularly, should they?
Definitely not. Definitely not. And I don't encourage people to, there's so many people jump on the scales on a daily basis. I think I think too, also people who've had issues with food in the past, if they had some eating disorders, these tend not to just disappear. And so I think if you were going back on the scales on a weekly basis, I think that could trigger some things from some more food issues that are very unhealthy. So once a week maximum, once a month ideal. And as you say, if you are really working to lose weight, once a week is good, but no more, definitely no more.
Yeah, it's good, wise advice. All right. Is there anything else you wanted to mention, Jude?
No, not really. I think I guess it's over to you as a doctor. You talked about the different tests you could do, and you know, drinking the sticky glucose drink and seeing how you respond. I was interested in what you think about the continuous blood glucose monitoring, which is something you could do as an ongoing thing to measure your blood glucose. What are your thoughts on that?
So that is another type of functional challenge, isn't it? So I eat and I'm measuring my blood glucose in real time. So I think for people who are, for well people, so there's a continuous glucose monitors or something you wear on your arm. They last for 2 weeks, and you on an app you can see what your blood glucose is over time. For people who are diabetic, it's a game changer. For non-diabetics who were wanting to see what foods do to their blood sugar, I think it's helpful in learning about foods, but it can be very difficult for some people who have sort of an obsessive type of personality. They get too bogged down in the weeds with it. But I think there is a place for it if you're trying to change behaviors, trying to change the foods you eat, and you're wanting to understand why. I think that's a great tool to supplement that behavior change. But we might need to wind it up.
Okay.
So thank you for listening, everyone. So in summary, there are ways to measure your body, measurements, body composition on DEXA scan, blood tests, functional tests, and what's right for you depends on your degree of health and what you're trying to change. So look after yourself. See you next time.
See you.